Hi everybody and welcome back to another Tonai Talks. This time we're going to be looking at attention and regulation, the complexity around ADHD. We're very lucky because again we've got Catherine Bailey joining us, who's a senior education psychologist specialising in working with children and young people who are neurodiverse. Catherine, would you mind just giving us a bit of an overview of what we are looking at today?
So what we're going to be looking at today is, as you said, the complexity around ADHD. When we come across children, young people with differences in their attention and concentration skills and their ability to regulate their behaviour, often we jump to the conclusion that they have ADHD. So what we're going to try and do today is sort of unpick that a little bit more and try and think about the presentation of children, young people a little bit differently, and try not to jump to the conclusion that they may have ADHD, because it is an incredibly complex picture. So we're going to be looking at what we mean by attention regulation. We're going to be looking at the factors that affect attention and regulation. We are going to be looking at actions that we can take or things that we need to consider before jumping to the ADHD hypothesis. And then we're going to be looking at how best to support and top tips for parents and carers. So we're covering quite a lot today, Caitlin.
All helpful stuff. So to start us off, Catherine, what do we actually mean by attention and regulation?
Okay, so attention in the context of this presentation is the process of paying attention, which involves different kinds of attention. So we're constantly switching and refocusing our attention throughout an activity. And for an adult, an average attention span in a sustained activity is up to 5 hours. So, for example, this allows us to watch a film or listen to a podcast. But that's the typical period of sustained attention for an adult. In an adult where there's some instances of switching and refocusing, the attention span is around 20 to 30 minutes. So that can be context dependent. So it depends on our level of interest, the mood we're in. So really, we're looking at like 20 or 30 minutes before we need to take a little bit of a break and then return to the task in hand. Children's attention span, in contrast, varies considerably by age. But normally, the attention span is somewhere in the region of their age plus 2 to 3 minutes. So, for example, a 5-year-old would expect their attention span to be about 5 minutes, plus approximately 2 to 3 minutes if we're very lucky. In terms of regulation, so regulation refers to the challenges in regulation of movement, other behaviours and emotions. Difficulties in these areas would be considered if the challenges are more pronounced and persistent than what would be typically expected for an individual's age or developmental stage. And then when we think about excessive activity, we're talking about physical or vocal activity. So, for example, excessive fidgeting or somebody who excessively talks. We're talking about difficulties in remaining seated or in one place at times when this is the expected norm. We're talking about restlessness, notable senses of agitation and an inability to relax. We are talking about being constantly on the go and an inability to engage in activities quietly. and I'm sure you can all hold in mind individuals that you come across in your daily lives where you can see excessive activity. When we're talking about impulsivity, we're talking about making quick decisions without evaluating risks or outcomes. So, for example, blurting out answers in a classroom, constantly interrupting others in a conversation. When you're out shopping, making spontaneous purchases without thinking, can I afford this? Do I really want this? So it's that difficulty in delaying gratification. So that strong urge to seek immediate rewards or satisfaction. Again, this can lead on to risk-taking behaviours. So by being very impulsive, we often see children, young people, individuals engaging in actions that are risky or potentially dangerous because they haven't considered the potential negative outcomes of their actions. So impulsivity and overactivity are very closely related and stem from difficulties with self-regulation. Now, all of these behaviours are normal in certain contexts and situations, and we all present with natural variations in our skills in these areas, which are influenced by a range of factors. So young people, for example, are naturally more active, impulsive and inattentive due to the development of the prefrontal cortex, which regulates these cognitive abilities and does not fully develop until adulthood. So it's typical for children to display these traits, and most adults show these traits throughout their daily life. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more information about what we mean when we're talking about attention regulation and impulsivity.
Absolutely. I think that was a really, really interesting overview, Catherine, and definitely very helpful in terms of understanding what both of these terms that we hear really often and may not actually understand, the depths of what they mean. So when we talk about kind of attention and regulation, what actually affects these? What factors affect our attention and our ability to regulate our attention?
Okay, well, there's many reasons, Caitlin, as to why attention regulation differences may occur. And what we tend to do is categorize or think about them in terms of environmental factors and within-person factors. So if you'll give me some time, I'm going to go through some of the environmental factors which affect attention regulation and then move on to those within-person factors which can be influential. So when we're thinking about environmental factors, one of the most important factors relates to family dynamics, sort of stressful home environments, including conflict or instability, which can be related to a range of factors, can very much impact a child's behaviour and attention. So these are things that we need to consider when we've got a child in our class who may be finding it really difficult to maintain attention and concentration and regulate their behaviour. We also need to consider the educational environment. Sometimes there are often mismatches between the child's needs and the demands made upon them within their school environment, which can lead to difficulties with attention and regulation. We also need to consider peer relationships. Often children may have difficulties in their peer relationships and may be subject to bullying or other social difficulties, such as significant fallout with friends, which can cause stress and distractibility. The next factor is particularly important in the day and age that we live now. So looking at socioeconomic factors, so financial stress and associated issues, such as lack of access to resources, can affect a child's attention and behaviour at school. We also need to consider a child or young person's exposure to trauma. So, for example, experiencing or witnessing violence or trauma can have significant impacts on attention and behaviour. Leading on from that, factors such as poor nutrition can have a negative impact, or food allergies or food sensitivities can have significant effects on cognitive functioning and behaviour. Obviously, we need to consider media and technology use, and obviously this is something that's really, really important in the current age that we live in. And what we know is that excessive screen time or exposure to inappropriate content online can contribute quite significantly to attention and behaviour issues. Another environmental factor relates to exposure to substances. So prenatal exposure, so that means when babies are in the womb, if parents are using or misusing alcohol, drugs, or tobacco, this can result in neurodevelopmental issues which can affect attention and behaviour. So really, when we're looking at ways that we can support parents, we're really looking at prenatal time periods, so the time when babies haven't actually been born yet but are in utero or in the womb. Environmental toxins also can have a role, so exposure to lead, for example, or other environmental toxins can impact brain development and function, which then can impact on attention and regulation. Unrealistic academic or behavioural expectations from parents, teachers, or peers can inevitably lead to high levels of stress and subsequent attention and behaviour issues, and or behaviours that present as undesirable but are otherwise developmentally appropriate. And then finally, we have, interest levels and boredom. So lack of engagement or interest in tasks can lead to inattentiveness and impulsive behaviour, particularly in children who may need more stimulating or hands-on activities to stay focused. So really, when we're coming across children, young people who seem to be very inattentive and finding it difficult to regulate their behaviour, we need actually to be looking at the tasks that we've designed for them to do or engage in, because that can have important consequences. So those are the main environmental factors that we may wish to consider when we're looking at attention and regulation differences. But there are also within-person factors that we also need to consider. So, for example, we need to consider the developmental stage of our children, young people. Naturally, younger children have shorter attention spans and higher levels of activity. So it's entirely developmentally appropriate for them to have a more limited capacity to pay attention. So it's really important that we're mindful of the developmental stage of the child or young person. Sleep, as we know, is really, really important in terms of everyday function, and insufficient or poor quality sleep can very much result in difficulties with inattention, overactivity, and impulsivity. Children with learning differences also have associated difficulties in processing information, which can lead to frustration and therefore inattention. And also mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression can result in restlessness, difficulty concentrating, impulsive behaviours, and low motivation or fatigue, the latter two of which can be misinterpreted as an attention difficulty. Sensory processing is also an important thing to consider, as over or under responsiveness to sensory inputs can affect attention and behaviour. Other within-person factors include brain injury, which can affect cognitive function, genetic factors such as Fragile X syndrome, medications, which can have side effects that impact attention and behaviour. And if there are other diagnoses in the profile of the child or young person, such as ADHD or autism spectrum disorder. So thinking about the within child factors and environmental factors, it's really, really important to think about how these interact, because often they will interact in complex ways, making it essential to consider a holistic approach when assessing and addressing attention, overactivity, and impulsivity in children and young people. Now, obviously, this isn't an exhaustive list of possible factors. There can be multiple factors which may affect an individual at the same time, at different times, and which can have an interactional effect. So the point is that it's a very complex picture, and we need to look at lots of different potential influences when we have a child in our classroom or at home with these presenting issues.
My goodness, there's a wealth of affecting factors, aren't there? And and like you said, they can have an impact on each other, which can worsen attention and regulation. So we've looked at these factors now. We've looked at what attention regulation is. So what could we consider? What should we consider? Sorry, before thinking about the ADHD pathway, because like you said, there's a number of things that can impact attention and regulation, and that isn't always necessarily the kind of ADHD as a diagnosis.
Absolutely. So that's really, really important to consider, because we've already talked about the complexities around influencing factors. So, it's important that we consider these factors when we have children, young people presenting with these differences. As we've already established, there can be many reasons for these differences, and these behaviours are normal. Even adaptive behaviours in some situations. So we do need to be really careful before considering the possibility of ADHD. And it shouldn't be our first port of call and the first possibility to be considered. As we know, ADHD is a neurodivergent condition. So this means that it's a within-person condition. And it's also a lifelong condition, and often amounts to a disability under the Equality Act 2010, even if the person does not themselves consider themselves to be disabled. Therefore, considerations of possible ADHD and referrals into an ADHD referral process shouldn't be considered lightly, and shouldn't be considered as the initial reaction when these difficulties are presenting themselves to us. So some of the things that we need to consider, are basic needs. So the first things first, is the child or young person sleeping well? Are they hungry? Are they in good health? All of these things will impact. We need to look at their academic performance and their social skills. Are they struggling in school? How do they develop relationships with others? Are they having peer relationships? As we've already mentioned, these things can cause a huge amount of frustration and stress, and then the knock-on effects then are limited attention and regulation. We need to consider their developmental milestones. Where are they at with their development? How old is the child? And things like sensory needs. So have they got any sensitivities around auditory input, visual input, proprioceptive input? These things will all have a significant impact. We also need to think about how interested and engaged a child is in the task that we're giving them. How long have they been presenting with these needs? So the time frame needs to be considered. We also need to think about, as I've already talked about, the family situation. What's the family history? Is the family context stable? Are there consistent routines at home? Do parents need support with parenting skills? These are all things which are really, really important factors. And then pervasiveness. How long have these needs been prevalent, and in what context? Is it just in one particular context or in a range of contexts? And lastly, but definitely not least, what is the voice of the child? What are the child or young person's perceptions of what's going on? What do they think works for them? What's not working for them? And they really are at the heart of formulating our views on what's going on for that particular child. In addition to that, teachers would also need to look at their lesson planning and their teaching and learning environment.
So, how best can we support children who are having difficulties with their attention and regulation?
So, as you can see on the slide, there are a number of things that we need to look at in the classroom, and then I'll go on then and look at top tips for parents. But it's really important that we adapt the learning environment. We've talked about neuroaffirming approaches, Caitlin, but with this in mind, we need to modify the physical classroom environment, adjust learning materials so that they are accessible to individuals, and employ varied teaching methods such as peer mentoring, practical learning, and computer assisted learning to make sure that the environment is meeting the needs of the child and that we're not expecting the child to fit in with the environment that we have set up. So we need to be very, very flexible about that learning environment. We also need to be very responsive and flexible to meeting the individual's needs. We need to ensure that strategies are tailored to the specific strengths and needs of the individuals. And in that respect, it's so important then to get the voice of the child because they know what works for them best of all in the majority of cases. Thirdly, we need to think about self-management and self-regulation. So it's important that we provide tailored support for self-management and self-regulation skills to help learners learn themselves to regulate their behaviour, emotions and attention effectively. And, the aim of this really is to develop independence in our learners so that, they can get to a stage where they feel empowered and skilled in knowing what works for them in terms of how they can regulate their behaviours and manage themselves appropriately in a given context. It's also really important to have a consistent system of rewards and consequence that are meaningful to the child, which will allow feedback to the child and allow them allow them to have clear messaging about what's appropriate and less appropriate, which will then act as a guide to their behaviours. So that's it in a nutshell, really, Caitlin.
Oh, so now that we've looked at kind of how we can support children with these difficulties in school or in the classroom, what are your kind of top tips for supporting them in the home?
Okay, so I think one of the really important takeaways is that it's really important to set boundaries with empathy. So while understanding the challenges that children and young people face, as I say, it's really important to set clear and empathetic boundaries. And the boundaries should be communicated in a way that are supportive and non-punitive. So, for example, rather than issuing consequences for meltdowns or impulsive actions, help the child understand the impact of the behaviour and guide them towards more positive alternatives. Reinforce the idea that everyone is working together to help them succeed, rather than framing their behaviours as intentional misbehaviour or them being naughty for being naughty's sake. It's really important to instill clear and consistent routines. Neurodivergent children, young people often thrive on routine. So providing a consistent schedule can help reduce anxiety and give children and young people a sense of stability. As we've talked about, it's really important to encourage desired behaviours through praise and rewards, where efforts and successes are recognised, no matter how small they may seem to us, because this will help build a child and young person's self-esteem and encourage repetition of those behaviours. It's really important to have sensory breaks and tools because some behaviours that we observe may stem from sensory overload or a need for sensory input. So providing sensory toys like fidget toys or allowing breaks during activities can help children regulate their sensory needs. It's also really important to teach coping skills. Let's work with our children, young people, on coping skills such as deep breathing, counting to 10, using words to express feelings instead of acting out. And practicing these skills regularly can help them manage challenging situations more effectively. And that will become more automatic the more we practice and over time. And finally, it's really, really important to support a child and young person's physical and emotional well-being. Let's encourage exercise, burn off excess energy through exercise. This will help lower the risk of depression, anxiety, and will promote sleep, improve concentration and focus, and stimulate the brain. Let's have good sleep hygiene. Let's try and include regular bedtime hours in the daily structure. As we know, good quality sleep helps regulate energy levels the next day and improve stress and mood. So we can't underestimate the importance of good sleep hygiene. Really important to take breaks, try and stay calm as much as possible, and also be kind to yourself. It can be tempting to imagine that everyone else is coping better, but if parents and carers speak to others with children of similar needs, they will likely feel the same way. Parents and carers should really appreciate the challenges they've overcome and take pride in their achievements, however small they may feel they are.
Those are some really, really helpful top tips for our parents generally with their kind of young people. What about kind of specifically for teenagers, Catherine? Do you have any kind of specific top tips, for that age group?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, as children with ADHD grow into teenagers, their needs and challenges evolve, as we well know. And supporting teens with ADHD requires a very different approach that considers their growing independence, the social pressures that they may be experiencing, and the academic responsibilities that comes with moving into adulthood. So I think the important thing that we must do is acknowledge their growing independence. As we know, teenagers naturally seek more independence, and this can sometimes clash with the structured routines that help manage ADHD. So it's good to work with your teen to find a balance between giving them autonomy and maintaining the support structures they still need. Involving them in decision making can really help them feel more in control and responsible. Secondly, supporting the academic challenges that they will be experiencing. And ADHD, we need to bear in mind, can make the increased academic demands of secondary school even more challenging. So it's, about helping your teen with time management, organisational skills, encouraging the use of planners or apps or other tools to keep track of assignments and deadlines, and regularly checking in with their teachers as parents and carers to ensure they're receiving any necessary accommodations. It's also really important to encourage healthy peer relationships. As we know, social dynamics become increasingly complex during the teenage years. Teens with ADHD may really struggle with impulsivity or social cues, which makes friendships all the more challenging. So encourage your teen to develop friendships with peers who understand and support them. Provide opportunities for positive social interactions, such as joining clubs or groups that align with their interests. That could be really, really beneficial. And also, it's really important to promote self-advocacy. As your teen matures, it's important for them to learn how to advocate for themselves, stand up for themselves. This includes understanding their ADHD, knowing what support they need, and being able to communicate this to teachers, friends, and future employers. Practice these conversations with them so that they feel confident, and this will enable them to be more equipped to speak up for themselves. And finally, really tune into their mental health. Teenagers with ADHD are at a significantly higher risk of developing anxiety, depression, or low self-esteem. So as parents and carers, we need to be mindful of any changes in mood or behaviour and provide a supportive environment where they feel safe discussing their feelings. If necessary, we may need to seek help from a mental health professional who understands ADHD. So, as we've discussed, Caitlin, there are various reasons as to why children and young people may present with attention regulation difficulties, with or without a diagnosis of ADHD. We've talked about the strategies that we would be thinking about in terms of supporting a child or young person with these needs.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Catherine. And thank you guys for tuning in today. Diolch yn fawr for joining us for our Tonai talk on the complexity of attention and regulation in ADHD. As I previously said, this is a series of talks on myth busting. So if you have a chance and you haven't already, please check out our previous talks in the Mythbusting series if they're of interest to you. And as always, you can scan the QR code to gain access to our live sessions that will be upcoming. I know we've talked about a lot today, so if you are interested in this topic and you require or you'd like to look into further support, we've put some links in the the caption below for you to have a look through. You may find these helpful. But yeah, like I said, if you feel like you'd like to look into this topic further. But thank you so much to Catherine for such an interesting talk.
Thank you for having me, Caitlin.
And thank you again, guys, for tuning in. And we will see you in our next Tonai Talks.